Hello, my name is Eli Piershag, and my project was an exploration of the war on drugs and its impact on mass incarceration through systematic racism. More specifically, my research question was, to what extent has the war on drugs impacted mass incarceration in the United States? And I wanted to do it a little differently and start by just sharing that this is something that I've always had kind of an interest in. My parents have a background in law, and I was just have always been curious with the legality of drugs and how harsh a lot of the U.S. laws are in comparison to other places around the world, and exactly why that is. Um, the writing process was overall really swift and easy to do just because I had such an interest in the topic and whatnot. It was fun to use some of like the sources from the library and see some more academic sources on it. That really helped with my research. So for the introduction, I'm going to go over the thesis and main points. So while the purpose of the law is to maintain societal order, the law must proportionally distribute justice through the criminal system in order to maintain a fair and functional system. However, as can be seen in modern-day America, groups of people are living with a disadvantage within the justice system. Many will state it is extreme and unviable to compare America's past treatment and cruel laws enforced on African Americans, in particular slavery, with the war on drugs and mass incarceration. However, there's a strong argument and justifiable comparison to be made when, when the, with the current corrupt system of mass incarceration is examined and traced down to its root causes and intentions. I have a quote from one of my sources, Lou here, who says, "Nothing has contributed more to the systematic mass incarceration of people of color in the United States than the war on drugs. While more than 50% of people in federal prisons are incarcerated for drug law violations, and of that 50%, black people comprise nearly 40% of those incarcerated in state or federal prison for drug law violations. So while these statistics show that the disproportion of people imprisoned, the growth of the imprisonment can be seen in the U.S. also can be attributed to the enforcement of tougher drug laws aimed at certain individuals. So it is both the systematic divide, it's aimed at African American people, but the drug laws are overall raking in lots of new prisoners, which we'll talk about why later. The war on drugs was a policy implemented specifically targeting African American communities for possession, which in turn led to the mass incarceration of minorities. There is now a clear correlation between mass incarceration and the oppression of minorities that continues a cycle of poverty, denial of civil rights, and influences the desolation of urban communities. The policy was enforced to wage war and target these poor communities of minorities, while the wealthy and elite remained untouched by said laws, showing the cracks and exploitation of the criminal justice system. This essay will show that the war on drugs is not only a new form of systematic oppression, maiming the advances in future minorities, but also the driving force behind the exponentially growing mass incarceration. Now we're going to talk a little bit about prisons and the historical context behind them. The start of the 18th century saw the industrialization of prison systems within the U.S. This movement was started in reaction to the end of the Civil War. With slavery now abolished, there was a need for free labor, and therefore Benjamin Bentham would introduce the Panopticopian model, which is a prison system that had over 400 cells, the first of its kind. And this would basically allow for a centrally placed observer to study all the inmates as prison wings radiated out from this central position. And this became the model for all prison buildings for the next half a century and really allowed for just the mass inhabitation of people. And it was really the discovery and the first step in regards to profit on a large scale from a prison. Talking about the black codes, the South was desperate to regain and lost slaves, so the Southern states would implement the Black Codes, later known as the Jim Crow laws, which were devised as a means of imprisoning as many freed African Americans as possible, done by significantly increasing the severity of punishments for simple acts like loitering, jaywalking, or public intoxication. And soon, the war on drugs would be used to target these poor communities and get them in prison for profit. Finally, we're going to cover the war on drugs. So in 1971, this marked the year that President Nixon officially declared the war on drugs, which led to the classification and regulation of them. A scheduled drug list was created, and the act would see LSD and heroin listed as Schedule 1 drugs along with marijuana, which just doesn't really make sense, especially because at the time marijuana was actually in medical journals, um, showing that they had possible help in different circumstances. So this was clearly a choice. And so his general attorney at the time stated that he was basically he knew that it was to imprison him. In future years, he would come forward and say that the campaign, Nixon's campaign, had two main enemies: the anti-war left and black people. He knew that the war on drugs campaign, this is a direct quote, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin or crack, we could criminalize them both heavily. We could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Do we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did. And so that quote in and of itself is just shows pretty clearly that it was meant to incarcerate, African Americans and minorities. And mass incarceration in America is now, federal prison populations are at about 790% more than they were 40 years ago, which is pretty crazy. And so while these prisons are using these people for money, for free labor, there's also studies that have shown that every prison doesn't correlate with a decrease in crime. It actually causes it to go up as there's less family stability and community stability, and the crime rate actually increases. Um, so, in conclusion, the war on drugs is a new form of systematic oppression, maiming the advances and future of minorities. Drugs may be bad morally, socially, and politically. However, passing a set of laws allowing for the targeting and imprisonment of minorities is beyond morally comprehensible, reinstating a new Jim Crow era. An organized collective movement is needed to address these injustices seen throughout our criminal justice system, and furthermore reform the building blocks of imprisonment within America, or the promises of the Civil Rights Act and the freedom that the Lady of Liberty so proudly depicts is merely a facade, and the U.S. can be seen continually catering to the wealthy and letting them exploit the system rather than being a nation for the people.